What happens when three street thugs think they've found the perfect victim walking alone through a dimly lit alley at 11 p.m.? What happens when that seemingly helpless woman in civilian clothes has spent the last 8 years mastering combat techniques that most people only see in movies? What happens when predators become prey in less than 60 seconds? This isn't just another story about street crime. This is the true account of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, a decorated Navy SEAL who was returning home from a quiet dinner when three armed men made the worst mistake of their lives. They saw a 5 feet 6 inches woman in a simple dress and heels. They didn't see the warrior who had completed over 40 high-risk missions in hostile territories around the world. In the next few minutes, these criminals would learn why Navy SEALs are considered among the most elite warriors on the planet. They would discover that true strength isn't about size, numbers, or even weapons. Sometimes, it's about the person who has been forged in the fires of the world's most demanding military training. This is a story about survival, justice, and what happens when evil chooses the wrong target. This is the night that changed everything for everyone involved, and it started with a simple walk home that became anything but simple. The evening air in downtown San Diego carried the familiar scent of ocean salt mixed with the distant hum of city life. Sarah Martinez adjusted her black dress and checked her watch as she stepped out of Romano's Italian restaurant, where she had just finished a quiet dinner celebrating her younger sister's college graduation. The celebration had been small, intimate, and exactly what Sarah needed after months of intense training exercises with her SEAL team. At 32 years old, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez had dedicated the last 8 years of her life to serving as one of the few women in the Navy SEALs. Her journey to this elite position hadn't been easy. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, Sarah had learned early that life didn't hand out participation trophies. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 3 children while working 2 jobs. Sarah had watched her mother struggle, watched her older brother get involved with the wrong crowd, and made a decision that would change the trajectory of her entire life. The decision to join the Navy came during her senior year of high school. While her friends were planning college parties and spring break trips, Sarah was studying military recruitment materials and preparing herself physically for what she knew would be the greatest challenge of her life. Her mother had cried when Sarah announced her plans, not because she wasn't proud, but because she understood the dangerous path her daughter was choosing. Basic training had been tough, but Sarah thrived under pressure. She discovered that the physical and mental challenges that broke other recruits only made her stronger. Her instructors noticed something special in the quiet girl from Los Angeles who never complained, never quit, and never let anyone see her sweat. When the opportunity to try for special operations came up, Sarah didn't hesitate. The path to becoming a Navy SEAL was brutal. Of the 23 candidates who started the program with Sarah, only 4 completed it, and she was the only woman. The training pushed every human limit imaginable. There were underwater demolition exercises that tested her ability to remain calm while literally drowning. There were survival training sessions in harsh environments where failure meant real danger. There were psychological evaluations designed to break the mind before the body gave out. But Sarah had something that kept her going when others quit. She had a deep understanding of what it meant to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Every time she wanted to ring the bell that would end her suffering and send her back to regular Navy duties, she thought about her mother working double shifts, about communities like the one she grew up in where people lived in fear, about the responsibility that came with having the ability to make a difference. The night she graduated from SEAL training, Sarah called her mother from a payphone outside the base. Her mother cried again, but this time they were tears of pure pride. Sarah had done something that most people considered impossible. She had earned her place among the most elite warriors in the world. Over the next 5 years, Sarah deployed to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She had been part of rescue operations in hostile territories, had helped take down terrorist cells that threatened innocent civilians, and had earned the respect of every person she served alongside. Her teammates didn't see her as a woman trying to prove herself in a man's world. They saw her as Senior Chief Martinez, someone they trusted with their lives, someone who had earned her place through blood, sweat, and an unbreakable spirit. The physical training never stopped. Even when she wasn't deployed, Sarah maintained a rigorous fitness routine that would challenge professional athletes. Her typical day started at 4:30 a.m. with a 6-mile run, followed by strength training, combat practice, and weapons maintenance. Her body was a precision instrument, trained to react instantly and efficiently in any situation. But, perhaps more importantly, Sarah's mind had been shaped by years of high-pressure decision-making. She had learned to assess threats in seconds, to remain calm when chaos erupted around her, and to trust her instincts even when logic seemed to suggest otherwise. These mental skills, combined with her physical abilities, made her incredibly dangerous to anyone who posed a threat to innocent people. The evening at Romano's had been a rare moment of normalcy for Sarah. She had worn a simple black dress instead of her uniform, had laughed with her sister about childhood memories, and had allowed herself to feel like a regular person for a few hours. The restaurant was in a safe part of downtown San Diego, an area she had walked through countless times without incident. As she made her way toward the parking garage where she had left her car, Sarah felt relaxed in a way that was unusual for someone with her training. Her natural alertness was still there, the subtle awareness of her surroundings that had kept her alive in dangerous places around the world. But she wasn't in full tactical mode. She was simply a woman walking home after a nice dinner with family. The route to the parking garage took her through a section of downtown that was well lit and normally busy, even late in the evening. However, construction work on the main street had forced her to take a detour through a series of smaller streets and alleys. The detour added about 10 minutes to her walk, but Sarah wasn't concerned. She had grown up in neighborhoods far more dangerous than this quiet commercial district. As she turned into the alley that would lead her to the back entrance of the parking garage, Sarah noticed that the area was quieter than usual. The construction had apparently disrupted more than just traffic flow. The normal foot traffic that kept these side streets busy had been diverted elsewhere. The alley was lit by only 2 functioning streetlights, creating pools of yellow light separated by stretches of shadow. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Without conscious thought, she began to assess her environment more carefully. She noted potential exit points, identified objects that could be used as weapons or cover, and adjusted her pace slightly to give herself more time to react if anything seemed wrong. This wasn't paranoia, it was simply the mental conditioning that had kept her alive in places where enemies wanted to kill her. About halfway through the alley, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. This wasn't unusual in itself, but something about the rhythm and spacing of the steps triggered her instincts. The person behind her wasn't just walking in the same direction, they were matching her pace and maintaining a consistent distance. When she slowed slightly, the footsteps slowed. When she sped up, they sped up. Sarah's heartbeat remained steady, but her mind shifted into a more focused state. She used the reflection in a storefront window to get a glimpse of the person following her. Male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. He was maintaining about 20 feet of distance, which was close enough to close quickly, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening to most people. As Sarah approached the end of the alley, where it opened onto the street where the parking garage was located, she heard additional footsteps. These were coming from ahead of her, from the direction she was walking. 2 more figures emerged from the shadows near the alley's exit. They positioned themselves casually, as if they were just hanging out, but their placement was clearly intended to block her path. Sarah's assessment of the situation took approximately 3 seconds. She was facing at least 3 individuals who had coordinated their positions to trap her in the alley. Their body language suggested hostile intent. The person behind her had closed the distance slightly and was now about 15 feet away. The 2 ahead of her were positioned to prevent her from reaching the street. Most people in this situation would feel panic beginning to set in. Sarah felt something entirely different. She felt the cold, focused calm that had seen her through combat operations in some of the world's most dangerous places. Her breathing remained controlled, her movement stayed fluid, and her mind began running through tactical options with the speed and precision of a computer. She had been in far worse situations than this. She had been outnumbered by trained soldiers in hostile territory. She had faced armed enemies with superior firepower and better positions. 3 street criminals in a San Diego alley were certainly dangerous to most people. But Sarah Martinez was not most people. The two men ahead of her began walking toward her, closing the trap. Sarah could see that at least one of them was armed, the outline of a handgun visible under his jacket. The person behind her picked up his pace as well. They were moving to surround her, a classic predator tactic designed to overwhelm the victim and prevent escape. Sarah continued walking at the same pace, giving no indica. The first attacker made his move when Sarah was still 20 feet from the end of the alley. He stepped directly into her path, pulling out what appeared to be a knife, while his partner moved to flank her from the left. The third man, who had been following her, closed in from behind, cutting off any retreat. Well, what do we have here?" the man with the knife said, his voice carrying the artificial confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "Nice dress, lady. Must have been an expensive dinner. Why don't you share some of that wealth with us?" Sarah stopped walking and appeared to look around nervously, as if she was just now realizing the danger she was in. Her performance was flawless, the acting of someone who had learned to blend in and appear harmless when necessary. But while her exterior projected fear and vulnerability, her mind was running through combat scenarios with deadly precision. The man with the knife was approximately 5 feet 10 inches, maybe 180 pounds, holding the weapon in his right hand with an amateur grip that told Sarah he wasn't trained in knife combat. His partner was larger, probably 6 feet 2 and over 200 pounds, but moving with the awkward confidence of someone who relied on size rather than skill. The third man, still behind her, was the wild card, but from the sound of his footsteps, he was probably similar in size to the first attacker. "Please," Sarah said, her voice shaking in just the right way to convince them she was terrified. "I don't want any trouble. I'll give you whatever you want." The knife-wielding attacker smiled, clearly enjoying what he perceived as complete control over the situation. "Smart girl. Let's start with that purse, and any jewelry you've got. And don't even think about calling for help. Nobody's going to hear you down here. And even if they did, nobody's stupid enough to get involved." Sarah slowly reached for her purse, continuing to play the role of the compliant victim while she made her final tactical assessments. The man with the knife had moved closer, now only about 8 feet away. His partner had positioned himself to her left, close enough to grab her if she tried to run. The third man had closed to within 10 feet behind her. What these men didn't understand was that Sarah had been in similar situations during her SEAL training, practicing scenarios where she was outnumbered and had to rely on speed, surprise, and superior technique to survive. The difference was that this wasn't training, and these weren't instructors who would stop the exercise if things went wrong. "You know what?" the knife man continued, clearly emboldened by her apparent cooperation. "Maybe we'll take a little more than just your money. Pretty girl like you, all dressed up with nowhere to go now." The threat of sexual assault changed everything. Sarah's mission parameters shifted from escape and avoidance to complete neutralization of the threat. These weren't just robbers anymore. They were predators who intended to cause serious harm, and Sarah's training kicked into full combat mode. "Please," she said again, taking a small step backward that positioned her perfectly for what was about to happen. "I'll give you everything I have. Just please don't hurt me." The knife man laughed and moved even closer, now only about 5 feet away. His overconfidence was about to become his downfall. He had no idea that the terrified woman in front of him could disarm him, disable him, and neutralize his partners in a matter of seconds. Sarah's transformation from victim to warrior happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She dropped her purse, which hit the ground with a deliberate sound that drew the attention of all 3 attackers for a split second. In that instant of distraction, Sarah exploded into motion with a speed and precision that none of them could have anticipated. Her first target was the knife man, who posed the most immediate threat. Sarah stepped inside his reach with lightning speed, her left hand grabbing his wrist and controlling the weapon while her right hand drove upward in a palm strike that connected with his nose. The impact was devastating, breaking his nose and sending blood streaming down his face while momentarily stunning him. Before he could react, Sarah twisted his wrist with a technique that had been drilled into her thousands of times. The knife clattered to the ground as the man's grip failed completely. Sarah followed up with a knee strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over, gasping for breath. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. The second attacker, the large man who had been flanking her, lunged forward to grab her, but Sarah was already moving. She spun away from his reaching arms and delivered a devastating elbow strike to his throat. The precision of the blow was surgical, hitting exactly the right spot to temporarily disable his ability to breathe or call out. As he stumbled backward, clutching his throat and making choking sounds, Sarah immediately pivoted to face the third attacker, who was rushing toward her from behind. This man had learned from watching his partners get demolished, and he approached more cautiously, trying to use his size advantage to overwhelm her. But Sarah had fought men much larger and stronger than him, trained fighters who knew how to use their size effectively. This street criminal was not in their league. She waited until he was almost within reach, then dropped low and swept his legs out from under him. As he fell, Sarah popped back up and delivered a precise strike to the pressure point on his neck, a technique that would render him unconscious without causing permanent damage. The third attacker crumpled to the ground, out cold. The entire confrontation had lasted approximately 15 seconds. Sarah stood in the alley, her breathing still controlled and steady, surrounded by 3 disabled attackers. The knife man was on his knees, blood streaming from his broken nose, still trying to catch his breath from the solar plexus strike. The large man was sitting against the alley wall, holding his throat and making raspy breathing sounds. The third man was unconscious on the asphalt. The transformation was complete. The woman who had appeared to be a helpless victim was revealed to be a highly trained warrior who had neutralized 3 armed attackers without sustaining any injury herself, and without using any weapons beyond her own body and training. Sarah quickly surveyed the scene to ensure there were no additional threats. Her training had taught her that situations like this could involve more participants than were initially visible. But the alley appeared to be clear except for the 3 men she had just defeated. She picked up her purse and pulled out her cell phone, then walked over to the knife that had been dropped and kicked it well away from any of the attackers. The knife man was starting to recover from the initial shock and was looking up at her with a mixture of fear and confusion that would have been comical under different circumstances. What are you?" he managed to gasp through the blood flowing from his nose. Sarah looked down at him with the calm, professional expression she might wear when debriefing after a mission. "I'm someone you shouldn't have messed with," she said simply. As she dialed 911, Sarah reflected on the irony of the situation. These men had chosen their victim based on the assumption that a woman alone would be vulnerable and defenseless. They had made their decision based on appearance, on stereotypes, and on their own experience with victims who couldn't fight back. They had no way of knowing that the woman in the black dress had spent years training in hand-to-hand combat, that she had faced down enemies in hostile territories around the world, or that she was capable of ending the lives of all 3 of them if the situation had required it. The 911 operator answered on the second ring. "911, what's your emergency?" "This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, U.S. Navy," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "I need police and medical assistance at the alley behind Romano's restaurant on 5th Street. I was attacked by 3 armed individuals. The attackers have been subdued and require medical attention." As she gave her location and waited for the police to arrive, Sarah considered how different this night could have been for a different victim. A woman without her training, without her experience, without her physical and mental conditioning, would likely have suffered serious harm at the hands of these 3 men. The thought made her angry, not at what had happened to her, but at what could have happened to someone else. These weren't first-time criminals. Their coordination, their choice of location, their practiced intimidation tactics all suggested that they had done this before, probably many times. How many other women had walked down this alley and encountered the first police car arrived within minutes, its red and blue lights painting the alley walls in alternating colors. 2 officers emerged cautiously, hands near their weapons, clearly unsure what they would find at the scene of an reported assault. What they discovered was unlike any crime scene they had encountered before. Sarah stood calmly near the middle of the alley, her black dress still immaculate, showing no signs of physical struggle. Around her, 3 men were in various states of distress. One sat against the wall holding his throat, another knelt on the ground with blood streaming from his nose, and The third lay unconscious on the asphalt. "Ma'am, are you the person who called this in?" asked the first officer, a veteran policeman named Detective Rodriguez who had seen his share of violent crimes but was clearly puzzled by this particular scene. "Yes, sir." Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, U.S. Navy. Sarah's response was crisp and professional, immediately establishing her military credentials and explaining much about the unusual situation the officers were witnessing. Detective Rodriguez looked around the alley again, taking in the positions of the disabled attackers and the calm demeanor of the woman who had clearly been their intended victim. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Sarah gave a concise, factual account of the attack and her response. She described the coordination between the three men, their threats of robbery and sexual assault, and her decision to defend herself using her military training. Her report was delivered with the same precision she would use in a military briefing, focusing on facts and avoiding unnecessary emotional details. As she spoke, paramedics arrived and began treating the three attackers. The knife man's nose was indeed broken, requiring immediate medical attention. The large man's throat injury was serious, but not life-threatening, though he would have difficulty speaking for several days. The third man was regaining consciousness, but showed signs of a concussion. "Senior Chief, I have to ask," Detective Rodriguez said after taking her initial statement. "What exactly is your military background? These injuries are very precise, very controlled. This doesn't look like a lucky fight. This looks like professional work." Sarah nodded, understanding the officer's confusion. "I'm a Navy SEAL, detective. I've been deployed multiple times to combat zones. Hand-to-hand combat and threat neutralization are part of my standard training." The detective's eyebrows raised slightly. He had heard of women serving in SEAL units, but he had never encountered one in person, especially not in circumstances like these. A Navy SEAL. That explains a lot. As the paramedics worked on the attackers, more police personnel arrived at the scene. A crime scene photographer began documenting the alley, collecting evidence, and photographing the positions where everything had taken place. The knife that had been dropped was bagged as evidence, along with other items found in the attacker's possession. What the police discovered during their search of the three men was troubling, but not surprising to Sarah. In addition to the knife, they found a handgun, zip ties, duct tape, and a small amount of cash that appeared to be taken from previous victims. These weren't opportunistic criminals who had stumbled into a robbery attempt. They were organized predators who had clearly planned and executed similar attacks before. Detective Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside as the investigation continued. "Senior Chief, based on what we're finding here, it looks like you interrupted something much more serious than a simple robbery. The items these men were carrying suggest they were planning to abduct you." Sarah had suspected as much from their behavior and threats during the confrontation. The coordination, the choice of location, and especially the sexual threats all pointed to something more sinister than a grab for money and valuables. "Detective, I'd like to suggest that you look into any recent attacks or disappearances in this area," Sarah said. "These men were too organized, too confident. They've done this before." The detective nodded grimly. "We're already thinking along the same lines. We'll be running their names through our database and checking with other jurisdictions. If there are other victims, we need to find them." As the evening progressed, the scope of the investigation expanded rapidly. The three attackers were identified as Marcus Thompson, Devin Williams, and Carlos Mendez, all of whom had extensive criminal records involving assault, robbery, and sexual crimes. More importantly, when police ran their names through regional databases, patterns began to emerge. Over the past 6 months, there had been 7 reported attacks in the downtown San Diego area that matched the same general pattern. Women walking alone, usually after evening events, targeted in areas where construction or other factors had reduced foot traffic. 4 of the women had been robbed and sexually assaulted. 2 had been abducted and found days later, traumatized and requiring extensive medical treatment. 1 woman was still missing. Detective Rodriguez returned to Sarah with this information as she was finishing her formal statement. "Senior Chief, I think you need to understand what you stumbled into tonight. These men aren't just street criminals. We believe they're responsible for a series of attacks that have terrorized women in this area for months. The weight of this revelation hit Sarah immediately. She thought about her sister, about all the women who worked late and walked home alone, about the victims who hadn't been able to defend themselves against these predators. The random choice of her as a target had led to the capture of serial criminals who had been operating with impunity. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we build a case that will put them away for a very long time, Detective Rodriguez replied. Your testimony will be crucial, but given the evidence we're finding and the pattern we're uncovering, I think we can make charges stick that will ensure they never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. As the crime scene was processed and the attackers were taken to the hospital under police guard, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. She had neutralized an immediate threat to herself, but in doing so, she had potentially saved the lives of future victims. 3 days after the alley incident, Detective Rodriguez called Sarah with news that would change everything about how the case was perceived. The investigation had uncovered far more than anyone had initially suspected, and Sarah's actions had interrupted a criminal enterprise that extended well beyond simple robbery and assault. Senior Chief, we need to meet, Detective Rodriguez said over the phone. What we've discovered about these 3 men is bigger than we thought. Can you come to the station this afternoon? Sarah arrived at the San Diego Police Department at 2 o'clock, still processing the media attention that had begun to surround her story. Local news outlets had picked up the basic facts. A female Navy SEAL had single-handedly defeated 3 armed attackers in downtown San Diego. The story had captured public imagination, but Sarah suspected there was much more to discover about what she had stumbled into. Detective Rodriguez met her at the entrance and led her to a conference room where several other investigators were waiting. The walls were covered with photos, timelines, and evidence boards that clearly represented weeks of intensive investigative work. Senior Chief Martinez, I'd like you to meet Detective Lisa Chun from our Human Trafficking Task Force, and FBI Special Agent Michael Torres, Rodriguez said as introductions were made around the table. The presence of federal investigators told Sarah that this case had grown far beyond a local crime story. What have you found? She asked. Detective Chin took the lead. The 3 men you apprehended are part of a much larger operation. We've been tracking a human trafficking ring that's been operating throughout Southern California for over 2 years. These men weren't just robbing and assaulting women randomly. They were procurement agents, targeting specific types of victims for a trafficking network. Sarah felt a chill as the full implications became clear. The missing woman from the earlier attacks hadn't simply been abducted and released. She had been taken for a far more sinister purpose. Special Agent Torres opened a thick file folder. Marcus Thompson, Devin Williams, and Carlos Mendez have all been cooperating with our investigation since their arrest. Facing the charges we can bring based on the evidence from that alley, plus what we've connected them to in other cases, they're looking at life in prison without parole. They're talking. The information the 3 men had provided led to a much larger criminal network. They had been working for an organization that trafficked young women to buyers throughout the western United States and internationally. The women were selected based on specific physical characteristics requested by buyers, abducted from carefully chosen locations, and transported through a network of safe houses before being delivered to their final destinations. Senior Chief, Detective Chun continued. The woman who's still missing from the downtown attacks? Her name is Jennifer Walsh. She's 24 years old, a graduate student at UC San Diego. Based on what these men are telling us, she's alive, and we think we know where she is. Sarah leaned forward, her training automatically shifting her into mission planning mode. What do you need from me? Agent Torres exchanged glances with the other investigators. Actually, we'd like to request your assistance with the rescue operation. This isn't standard procedure, but the circumstances are unusual. The location where we believe Ms. Walsh is being held is heavily guarded, and the traffickers have military-grade weapons and training. Our tactical teams are excellent, but having someone with your specific combat experience could make the difference between a successful rescue and a disaster. The request was unprecedented. Sarah was active-duty military, and involving her in a civilian law enforcement operation would require approvals from multiple levels of command. But the urgency of the situation and the specific skills she could bring to a hostage rescue scenario made it worth pursuing. "Where is she?" Sarah asked. Detective Chun pointed to a location on a detailed map spread across the conference table. A compound in the mountains east of the city. It's isolated, well-defended, and, according to our intelligence, there are at least 8 armed guards plus the trafficking organization's leadership. They've been using this location as a staging area before moving victims to final destinations. Sarah studied the map, her mind automatically analyzing approach routes, defensive positions, and tactical challenges. The compound was situated on high ground with excellent visibility in all directions, making a surprise approach extremely difficult. The buildings were arranged to provide overlapping fields of fire for defenders. This was not a target that could be taken with standard law enforcement tactics. Timeline? Sarah asked. According to Thompson, they move victims every 2 weeks. Jennifer Walsh has been there for 9 days, which means we have less than a week before she's transported somewhere we may never find her. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. A young woman's life hung in the balance, and she had the skills that could make the difference between rescue and tragedy. But involving herself in this operation would also mean stepping outside normal military channels and taking on risks that could affect her career and her team. Agent Torres seemed to sense her internal conflict. "Senior Chief, I want to be clear about what we're asking. This would be a joint operation between federal law enforcement and military special operations. We've already reached out to your chain of command, and they're willing to provide support if you volunteer for this mission. This isn't an order, it's a request." Sarah thought about Jennifer Walsh, about the other victims who had suffered at the hands of this trafficking ring, and about the fact that her chance encounter in a downtown alley had led to uncovering something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had realized. "I'm in," she said simply. "What's the plan?" Over the next 4 hours, the investigative team briefed Sarah on everything they knew about the compound, the trafficking organization, and the challenges they would face in mounting a rescue operation. The detailed intelligence painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise with resources and capabilities that far exceeded typical street-level crime. The trafficking ring was led by a man named Viktor Kozlov, a former Russian military officer who had immigrated to the United States 15 years earlier and gradually built a network that stretched from California to New York. His organization was responsible for hundreds of missing persons cases, generating millions of dollars in revenue through the sale of human beings. The compound where Jennifer Walsh was being held served multiple functions for Kozlov's operation. It was a holding facility for victims before transport, a training center for the armed guards who protected the organization, and a meeting place for buyers who came to inspect merchandise before purchase. "The good news," Detective Chin explained, "is that we have detailed intelligence about the compound's layout and security measures." Thompson provided blueprints and guard schedules in exchange for a plea agreement. "The bad news is that even with this intelligence, it's going to be an extremely dangerous operation." Sarah reviewed the compound layout, noting defensive PA. The rescue operation began at 0300 hours on a moonless Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Sarah's encounter in the alley. The federal task force had assembled a team of 24 agents and officers, supported by specialized equipment and Sarah's tactical expertise. The mission was designated Operation Safe Harbor, and its success would determine the fate of Jennifer Walsh and potentially several other victims. Sarah crouched behind a rocky outcropping 800 meters from the compound, reviewing the target through night vision equipment. The intelligence had been accurate. The buildings were arranged in a defensive pattern around a central courtyard, with guard towers at 2 corners and roving patrols covering the perimeter. Heat signature analysis showed at least 12 individuals inside the main building, confirming the presence of multiple hostages. Teams Alpha and Bravo are in position. Came the whispered radio communication from Agent Torres, who was leading the coordinated assault. "Senior Chief, what's your assessment?" Sarah had spent the previous day studying every detail of the compound and developing the tactical plan that would guide the operation. Her role was to lead a small team through the most dangerous approach route, neutralizing the guard towers and creating a diversion that would allow the main assault teams to breach the hostage-holding area. "Target remains consistent with intelligence reports," Sarah replied into her radio headset. Two guards visible in the North Tower, one roving patrol completing circuit on the east side. On beginning approach to primary objective. Sarah's team consisted of herself and 3 FBI tactical agents, all of whom had extensive SWAT experience but had never worked with a Navy SEAL before. They had trained together for 36 hours, building the coordination necessary for this type of precision operation. Moving with the silent efficiency that had kept her alive in hostile territories around the world, Sarah led her team across the open ground toward the compound. The terrain was rocky and uneven, providing some cover, but also presenting noise hazards that could alert the guards to their presence. The first objective was the North Guard Tower, where 2 armed men were positioned with automatic weapons and radio equipment. Eliminating this position would remove the defenders' best observation point and prevent them from calling for reinforcement from other trafficking organization sites. Sarah reached the base of the tower structure and signaled for her team to hold position while she climbed. The tower was constructed of steel framework with a wooden platform at the top, rising approximately 20 feet above the surrounding buildings. Climbing it silently required every bit of her physical conditioning and technical skill. The 2 guards were focused on scanning the approaches to the compound, never imagining that someone might be climbing directly up to their position. Sarah reached the platform level and paused, listening to their conversation and assessing their exact positions before making her move. In one fluid motion, she pulled herself onto the platform and neutralized both guards using techniques that rendered them unconscious without causing permanent injury. Within seconds, the tower was secured and the guard's radio equipment was in her control. Tower 1 neutralized, she reported quietly. Moving to secondary objectives. The next phase involved creating a diversion that would draw attention away from the main assault point, while simultaneously cutting off escape routes for the trafficking organization's leadership. Sarah's team moved through the compound's outer defenses, systematically disabling security systems and neutralizing guards who might interfere with the rescue operation. The precision and speed of their movement reflected months of training and years of experience in high-risk operations. Each team member knew their role exactly, and their coordination was flawless despite the dangerous and unfamiliar environment. Alpha Team, you have green light for breach, Sarah radioed as her team completed their diversionary objectives. All perimeter security neutralized. You own the approach. The main assault began with textbook precision. Alpha and Bravo teams simultaneously breached the main building from 2 sides, using flashbang grenades and coordinated movement to overwhelm the remaining defenders before they could harm the hostages. Sarah monitored the progress from her position at the north end of the compound, ready to provide support if the assault teams encountered unexpected resistance. The sound of gunfire echoed across the mountainous terrain as the final confrontation with Viktor Kozlov's armed guards played out inside the buildings. We have hostiles down, no casualties on our side, came Agent Torres's voice over the radio. Moving to secure the detention area. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything they had planned and risked depended on finding Jennifer Walsh and any other victims alive and unharmed in the compound's holding facility. Target acquired, Torres reported after what felt like an eternity, but was actually less than 2 minutes. We have 5 hostages, all alive. Jennifer Walsh confirmed among them. Medical team, you're clear to enter. Sarah felt a surge of relief and professional satisfaction. The mission had succeeded. Jennifer Walsh was alive, and for other women who hadn't even been reported missing had been rescued from a fate that would have destroyed their lives. But the operation wasn't over. Viktor Kozlov himself had been captured in the assault, along with 8 of his associates. The evidence seized at the compound would lead to the dismantling of trafficking networks throughout the western United States and potentially save hundreds of additional victims. As dawn broke over the mountain compound, Sarah surveyed the scene of what had been one of the most successful operations of her military career. The collaboration between military special operations and federal law enforcement had achieved something that neither could have accomplished alone. Jennifer Walsh was transported to a hospital for medical evaluation and psychological support. Despite her ordeal, she was physically unharmed and would survive to rebuild her life. The other 4 rescued women were also receiving medical care and would be reunited with families who had given up hope of ever seeing them again. Viktor Kozlov and his associates faced federal charges that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives in prison. More importantly, the intelligence gathered during the raid led to the identification and arrest of trafficking ring associates in 7 other states, effectively destroying one of the largest human trafficking organizations operating in the United States. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself testifying before federal grand juries, meeting with family members of rescued victims, and dealing with media attention that she had never sought but couldn't avoid. The story of the Navy SEAL who had single-handedly defeated 3 attackers and uncovered a major criminal conspiracy captured national attention. But, for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came when Jennifer Walsh asked to meet her at the hospital 3 days after the rescue. The young graduate student was recovering well physically, and her psychological counselors felt that meeting the person who had made her rescue possible would be beneficial to her healing process. "I don't know how to thank you," Jennifer said when they met in a quiet conference room at the medical facility. "The police told me how this all started, how you fighting off those men led to finding me. I don't think I would have survived much longer if you hadn't been exactly where you were that night." Sarah looked at the young woman, seeing strength and resilience that reminded her why she had chosen a career dedicated to protecting others. "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied. "What happened to you should never happen to anyone. I just did what my training prepared me to do." Jennifer smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since her rescue. "The doctors say I'm going to be okay. It's going to take time, but I'm going to finish my degree and get back to my life. These people didn't break me, and that's partly because you made sure they didn't have the chance." As Sarah left the hospital, she thought about the random series of events that had led to this outcome. A simple decision to walk through a particular alley, taken by 3 criminals who thought they had found an easy target, had unraveled a criminal enterprise and saved multiple lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Saw the news coverage about the trafficking ring arrests. I'm so proud of you. Mom would be proud too." Sarah smiled as she typed back, "Just doing my job. Looking forward to a quieter family dinner next time." But even as she wrote those words, Sarah knew there would never really be quiet for someone with her training and her commitment to protecting innocent people. There would always be another threat, another situation where her skills could make the difference between justice and tragedy. The alley encounter had ended with 3 attackers defeated and arrested. The investigation had concluded with a major criminal organization dismantled and multiple victims rescued. But for Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, it was simply another chapter in a career dedicated to standing between evil and those who couldn't protect themselves. As she drove home through the streets of San Diego, Sarah reflected on the fact that sometimes being in the right place at the right time meant being ready to do what others couldn't do. Sometimes it meant being willing to step up when circumstances demanded courage and skill. And sometimes it meant accepting that the quiet life wasn't an option for those who had the ability to make a real difference in the world. The story that had begun with predators choosing the wrong victim had ended with justice served and lives saved. For Sarah, that was exactly the kind of ending her training had prepared her to achieve, and exactly the kind of responsibility she had chosen when she decided to become a Navy SEAL. Citations, potential entry points, and likely escape routes. Her SEAL training had included numerous hostage rescue scenarios, but this operation would present unique challenges due to the terrain, the number of defenders, and the need to ensure the safety of potentially multiple victims. "How many hostages are we looking at?" she asked. Agent Torres consulted his notes. "Jennifer Walsh for certain, but there may be others. The compound can hold up to 12 people in the detention area, and we don't have current intelligence on occupancy levels." The complexity of the mission was becoming clear. This wouldn't be a simple breach and rescue operation. They would need to locate and secure multiple potential victims while neutralizing a significant defensive force, all while operating in unfamiliar terrain against enemies who had every advantage of position and preparation. As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. Her decision to walk through that particular alley, the attacker's choice of her as a target, and her successful defense had uncovered a criminal network that might otherwise have continued operating for years. Now, She had the opportunity to help rescue victims and shut down an organization that had caused immeasurable suffering. The planning phase would take another 24 hours, during which time intelligence gathering would continue and tactical preparations would be made. Sarah would need to coordinate with her naval command, undergo briefings with federal law enforcement tactical teams, and prepare mentally for what could be one of the most challenging operations of her career. As she left the police station that evening, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 3 days. She had gone from celebrating her sister's graduation to becoming the key figure in a major law enforcement operation. The quiet military professional who preferred to stay out of the spotlight was about to become involved in a high-profile rescue mission that would test every skill she had learned in her years as a Navy SEAL. But, more importantly, she was about to help save the life of a young woman who had become a victim of one of the most evil crimes imaginable. For Sarah, that made everything else secondary to the mission at hand. The local news media began arriving at the scene, drawn by reports of an unusual incident involving a female Navy SEAL. Sarah declined to speak with reporters, preferring to let the police handle public communications, but she knew the story would eventually become public knowledge. Detective Rodriguez offered to have an officer drive Sarah to her car, but she declined, preferring to walk the remaining distance to the parking garage. The alley no longer felt threatening to her. If anything, it felt safer knowing that the predators who had been using it to hunt victims had been removed. As she finally reached her car and began the drive home, Sarah reflected on the random nature of what had happened. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time from the attacker's perspective, but the right place at the right time from the perspective of justice and public safety. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister, asking if she had made it home safely. Sarah smiled as she typed back a simple, "Yes, all good. Interesting walk, but I'm fine." There would be time to explain everything later, but for now, she wanted to process what had happened and consider its implications. The next few days would bring media attention, legal proceedings, and probably some paperwork from her Navy superiors who would want to understand how one of their SEALs had become involved in a civilian law enforcement matter. But tonight, Sarah was simply grateful that her training had prepared her for an unexpected threat, and that 3 dangerous criminals would no longer be able to prey on innocent people. As she drove through the quiet streets of San Diego, Sarah couldn't help but think about the woman who was still missing, the one who had been taken by these same men and hadn't yet been found. Tomorrow, she would call Detective Rodriguez and offer any assistance she could provide in the investigation. Tonight, she would rest with the knowledge that she had helped make her community a little safer. The evening that had started with a family celebration had ended with the capture of serial predators. It wasn't the quiet night Sarah had planned, but it was exactly the kind of outcome her training had prepared her to achieve. Sometimes, being in the right place at the right time meant being ready to do what others couldn't do, to stand up to evil when it presented itself, and to use her abilities to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The real story was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez would find herself at the center of investigations, legal proceedings, and a community's gratitude for her courage and skill in the face of danger. These same men, how many victims had there been who couldn't fight back, who didn't have the skills to turn the tables on their attackers? The knife man was trying to get to his feet, still dazed from the confrontation. Sarah moved slightly, positioning herself where she could react quickly if any of them tried to flee or escalate the situation. But it was clear that the fight was completely out of all 3 men. "Stay down," she told them, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Police will be here soon. If any of you tries to leave, or if you make any threatening moves toward me or anyone else, you'll regret it more than you already do." The large man who had been choking was starting to breathe more normally, but he looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and bewilderment that suggested he still couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened to him and his partners. In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of sirens approaching. The police response time was impressive, probably less than 5 minutes since her call. As the sounds grew closer, she realized that this incident was far from over. There would be statements to give, reports to file, and questions to answer. But, more importantly, there would be an investigation into these 3 men and their criminal activities. Sarah had a strong suspicion that when the police looked into their backgrounds, they would find a pattern of similar attacks, other victims who hadn't been as fortunate as she had been. The night that had started as a quiet family celebration was about to become something much more significant, not just for Sarah, but for the community that these predators had been terrorizing. Tie-in that she had noticed their coordination. To any observer, she appeared to be an unaware victim walking directly into a trap. But behind her calm exterior, Sarah was making calculations and preparing for what she knew was about to happen. She estimated the weight and reach of each potential attacker. She identified the most immediate threats and planned her initial responses. She noted the positions of objects in the alley that could be used tactically. Most importantly, she prepared mentally for the sudden transition from peaceful evening to combat situation. The men clearly believed they had chosen an easy target. A woman alone, dressed nicely, presumably carrying money and valuables, walking through an isolated area where no one would hear her scream for help. They had no way of knowing that their intended victim had spent years training for exactly this type of situation, that she had faced down enemies far more dangerous than themselves, and that they were about to make a mistake that would change all of their lives forever. As the distance between Sarah and her attackers continued to close, the night air seemed to grow thicker with tension. In a few more seconds, these criminals would learn that sometimes the predator becomes the prey, and sometimes the person who looks most vulnerable is actually the most dangerous person in any given situation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be over almost before it began, but the consequences would last much longer than any of the participants could imagine.